Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. This is the October Microsoft Graph Community Call for 2020. We appreciate you joining us this morning or this afternoon, evening, whatever time it is for you. I got a great agenda lined up for today. We're talking a little bit about the Microsoft Graph Ignite recap. So what things were announced, what things we're releasing, and a couple things that are going to be coming along in the future here. And then we're also going to round out with a little bit of talk on the new PowerShell SDK that just went GA at Ignite, and then a future peek at the CLI that Darrell and team are working on. So for our agenda today, again, we're going to talk about our Ignite recap from Ben Summers, who's one of our marketing directors. And then Darrell Middle will join us to talk about the PowerShell SDK that recently went GA and the upcoming CLI work that is going on. So without further ado, we'll jump into our first topic. Ben, the floor is yours for the Ignite recap.
Hey, thanks, Brian. Okay, so hi, everybody, and good morning or good afternoon, wherever it is that you are. I wanted to just offer folks a quick recap of where at Ignite you might have seen the graph, because there was actually a lot of graph news. And if you weren't able to attend or you had some trouble navigating, because I understand we're still sort of learning how to do the virtual events, this is just a good way to get a quick overview and let you know sort of where you're going to hear that messaging across the different places. So first of all, one of the things that has sort of increasingly become a service area where we have visibility for the graph now is in keynotes. So it's something that you'll hear Satya talk about fairly regularly. And if you watch Jared Spataro's keynote, he actually does quite a lot of time spent talking about the Microsoft Graph, obviously more in sort of a first party, powering first party experiences perspective. But I think that's probably very important for us to get across, because really one of the things that we love about the Microsoft Graph is that it is something that we use to power our own experiences as much as we do. So there's a lot of emphasis on its capabilities being placed in the view of executives these days, which is actually very exciting for us. And then, of course, also within the actual boundaries of the event itself, there was a digital breakout with Ina Arenas and Mike Amerlon, which was more broadly, I suppose, from a title perspective, around Microsoft 365 and the platform. But if you really went to that talk, there's a lot of, mother of the graph, Ina Arenas, there talking about all the new things that are happening within the surface of the graph, and also giving an overview as well. So we spent a lot of time there. And then there were pre-records. So myself and Hamad Rajub and James Lau did a pre-record on graph services. And then there is this concept of the virtual hub that was a little different this year. And, I probably should pause here for folks just to say that you may have been a little bit confused about the fact that there was an Ignite event and an Ignite catalog, and then this virtual hub that sort of sat just outside of the event, which had its own catalog. And so I want to make sure that everybody understands that, that there is this additional space where we placed all of those sort of deeper skilling sessions. So I think there were 8 of them in total for the graph. A number of graph sessions there, included featuring people like Darrell, for example, and folks from the Graph Toolkit team, et cetera, et cetera. We talked about connectors. We talked about a lot more than just the stuff that we covered in keynotes. And if you went to aka.ms/virtual hub, you could navigate your way through that area and into all the different content that we built, not just for Graph, but for the Microsoft 365 platform. So if you're going to go back through the event, if you haven't had time to watch or you think that you missed certain things, I would certainly tell you guys to spend a little bit of time watching some of the keynotes. They go by very fast. They're 30 minutes. That's sort of the way that things are paced in these events now. And then I would say also go to the virtual hub and make sure that you get sort of the opposite of the keynote experience and find yourself getting that deeper content that we also prepare for events like these. So probably the biggest sort of news or theme that emerged this year was this idea that what we're calling graph services, or Microsoft Graph Services, are now really coming to the fore. And I'll give you 4 examples. I know that in the talk that I did, I only talked about 3 of these things in any great detail, but I decided when I sort of did my recap and thought about how I would present it to you all, I wanted to put this 4th thing in here. So we have this new class of Microsoft Graph Services where we're not just exposing, say, data or endpoints. We're sort of exposing some of the IP behind our own services and pushing that out in different ways to the community to use against the graph endpoint or its infrastructure that we're exposing that is sort of, I guess, more broadly graph powered. We could get into a debate about that with engineers and marketers, but I'm not going to go there right now. But the first thing that was really interesting that we announced was the preview of Azure Communications Services. And this is where we're actually starting to take the infrastructure that powers the calling and data and messaging and voice capabilities behind Microsoft Teams and exposing those as APIs, actually as an Azure service in this instance, which is probably the most unique thing about it right now. That preview is now something that is live, and I think that you'll see it move to GA in the next couple of months. So that's the first really important sort of concept of a service that we introduced. The next thing is that connectors, the GA of connectors or search connectors in particular, were announced. So you guys can now go out and build these connectors that allow you to connect other clouds or connect on-prem data into experiences within your Microsoft 365 tenant. We also announced the preview of a number of security and compliance capabilities, so an export API, a Teams DLP API, or for monitoring compliance and data loss prevention within the surface area of your tenant. And then finally, the fourth one that I added here was that we're also previewing now these print services where you can use the graph to replace some of the traditional cloud print and print management workloads that have been hard to distribute, hard to deal with. You can actually do those now through the Microsoft Graph. Like I said, they are in preview, and you'll see them come to general availability over time. All right, so that was sort of the first big idea of stuff that we presented. But of course, we also did a lot of work on the more traditional workloads, shall we say. So you'll see on this list some of the things that I just talked about because they're, I try to be comprehensive here, but you can see in addition to our search connectors, GA and the Azure Communications Services, Security Compliance and Universal Print, we also expanded our preview of the resource-specific consent work that we've been doing for the last several months. We continue to expand our to-do API previews. So that's out there for those of you guys that are looking for that sort of personal task management rationalization that we've been doing. Search API preview, I think we do have more improvements to that preview. We did not announce GA yet, but it's coming. Taxonomy APIs as well. Those are the taxonomy APIs that go along with Project Cortex. So those are the things that allow you to go in and define your own custom taxonomies for the kind of work that the Cortex services will eventually offer. And then finally, we announced a Stream API. We made a Stream API announcement, which I think really was more about how we would include it as a file type in SharePoint, as opposed to doing separate things with the Stream APIs. And then we continue to work on conditional access for directory objects. All right, so this is just a list. I think that rather than me draining lists, I'm going to skip to the next slide and just sort of hit what I think are the remaining big items that you guys should be aware of. Not going to steal any thunder from Darrell on PowerShell. There is a session that he's going to talk about it a little later, I'm sure, but it's general availability. Congratulations, Darrell. There were more advancements made to the Graph Toolkit. And then I think probably the last thing to talk about on this slide that's important is this idea that app certification and publisher verification updates were announced. I think this week actually was the formal GA for publisher verification. So that is a process that is now ready to go. I think you should check that out. There should be some announcements about it in our blogs. And for those of you that aren't doing that as a standard way of managing your apps or getting your apps ready to share, please do this. It's going to be something that over time we require. So you might as well start building a muscle in making sure that you do this and learn about it. So app verification and ultimately app certification are something that are super important for us. It's our way of saying that your apps are trustworthy and that we've verified your publishers, and you get to take that certification from Microsoft and give it to your customers. And I want to make sure that everybody understands that it's valuable all around. So please do it. If you want to just make sure that you get the full news, the full wrap up, if you haven't read the blog, just make sure that you do go to our main Graph blog. That's the blog that lives on our graph.microsoft.com site, and look for the blog titled The Emergence of Graph Services. It's got links to all the sessions in it, as well as to resources and documents. And I think that it's probably the one place that I can point you to say like, hey, make sure that you go there, and that you can use to sort of navigate through the event and through all the other assets that, fortunately, unlike a live event, persist online in ways that they wouldn't if you'd have had to fly to New Orleans. So yes, so that's a very fast, very speedily delivered recap of what happened at Ignite this year. The most important thing, I guess, really is make sure that you do go watch the skilling sessions. Make sure you go to that hub, that aka.ms virtual hub link. That's where I think the real substance of the work that we did to prepare to get you guys skilled up is. So that's my recap. With a number of other folks from Microsoft on the call, is there anything that you would add or any things that you would also want to promote, or did we sort of hit all the highlights here?
I think those are the main ones that I would have called out. Trying to think through the list of anything else that was major announcements related to Graph.
Actually, you know what? I had one other thing that it wasn't really Graph per se, but for people that one of the long-awaited announcements that we finally got to was SSO for add-ins, and I guess that if you're somebody that wants to bring Graph-powered experiences into your add-ins, that's just a nice little additional thing to know about that happened. Otherwise, it's a little tangential, but maybe a lot tangential. But it is still the other thing that, surprisingly enough, sort of caught my attention when I looked at everything. All right, so
the chats. One thing Vincent did call out in the chat on here, the Teams product group, they did GA their change notifications for, that was chat messages, correct, Vincent?
Yeah, so that's the DLP. The change notifications is for the chats. That's part of the DLP or the stuff that I was talking about earlier. So that's if you're looking for, I guess, the specific name of it, the chat messages and channel messages. That's right. That is our DLP API that I was referring to, but that really is there, designed specifically for DLP scenarios. So
yep.
At any rate, so thanks.
One other thing I will call out, I believe we also went into public preview, Vincent, with the change notifications via Azure Event Hubs. Is that correct too? So if you're looking for an alternative way to receive change notifications rather than just webhooks, we do have an alternative as well now for going through Azure Event Hubs, which solves a number of scenarios in terms of like throttling, not having a public endpoint directly on the internet, and a few other kind of edge scenarios that may come up that you may need to have some support for. So that is in our documentation. If I can find the link quickly while we're chatting here, I'll post it in there unless Vincent happens to have that really handy.
Yeah, I'll put it, don't worry.
Okay, thanks.
And speaking of Vincent, we forgot to mention that he shipped the beta SDK for Java. So you can now access the Microsoft Graph beta via Java if you're a Java dev.
Excellent. Well, we do have a couple minutes here. If there are any questions related to the Ignite content or any of the recap that Ben shared on here, feel free to put them in the chat window. We've got just a couple minutes here. Otherwise, we will switch over to Darrell's topic.
All right, so I'll turn it over back to you, Brian, and we'll move on to the next.
All right, thank you so much, Ben.
As Ben mentioned, we have shipped the PowerShell SDK to GA, but we're not done by a long shot. This is a V1 product, and those folks who've been in the Microsoft ecosystem a long time know that Microsoft isn't really done until they hit around about a V3 of a product. But shipping is a feature, and there's a lot of functionality in there that is very valuable. And we got feedback from community folks that yes, people are using this, they're using it with their customers, and therefore we want to get that out there and get people using it. The things, like if I wanted to call out some of the big things that we're going to be working on, some of the gaps, we are working towards bringing full sovereign cloud support. At the moment, the SDK is only targeted to the public cloud. You will find if you try and make calls to things that don't return JSON responses, you may not be very successful in all particular cases. And I'll show you some workarounds to that. But things like reports, things like streaming type data, images, and things like that, we still need to do a little bit of work to get all of those working as they should. And one other piece is what we call heterogeneous type. So where you go and get a collection, what you're going to get back from that collection is just kind of the base type. Often you'll get just a directory object. You won't actually get the full derived type. And again, these are things, because we're auto-generating, we are kind of dependent on some of the metadata infrastructure in order to do the right thing. And so we got additional work to do there. Before we go further, I want to talk a little bit about the naming of this module, because I've had quite a bit of feedback. Like, why is it called an SDK? like other PowerShell modules often are not, they don't tend to use that terminology. And as I go through this session, I'm going to call out a number of places why it's kind of helpful to have an SDK, and we all know naming is hard, right? And we've gone back and forwards on whether or not to attach this moniker, but there's some value to reminding folks that this is something that people can build upon. It isn't just a here's a thing, use it out of the box, and you can't change it, right? There are ways that we can build, and we are encouraging people to build upon this. So we've talked a lot about things about what we haven't done. What have we done? Let's get a bit more positive here. I did do a session at Ignite, and I have a link to it further on in the deck, and I encourage you to watch that. These first couple of slides, there's a little bit of overlap, but I want an opportunity for if people have questions as I go through these two. The demo that I'm doing, there's almost no overlap. So it was a little hard, you're doing a PowerShell demo at Ignite, you want to cover everything, and then it's like, okay, now we're going to do another one. How do I talk about things differently? So I'll dig a little bit deeper in some of the more edge case stuff in the demo. Paul in the chat has mentioned about async operations. Yes, thank you, Paul, for reminding me. There's another thing. Async operations, things that return a 202 from the API, it will actually work, but there's no way for you to actually go and monitor. Like, is it done yet? Is it done yet? We'll find a solution to that. Alan asks, will the PowerShell SDK for Graph include the functionality from MS Online module, EXO module, and Skype for Business model? That is an excellent question, and I'm going to deal with it straight away. The goal is to cover the entire of Microsoft Graph. There's some capabilities that we currently don't support because the APIs are not on Microsoft Graph. So some of the Exchange Online administration capabilities are not on Graph yet. Now, we have a really, really strong push within Microsoft to get all of this functionality on Graph so that it will become available in the PowerShell modules. When it comes to the AAD capabilities, the goal is to get all of that AAD capabilities on Graph so that everything will be available via this single PowerShell module. It's the primary reason we built this thing was because of this feedback from customers saying, I don't want to have to deal with 5 different PowerShell modules. I want to get one token. There are some things in the MS Online module, and I'm not intimately familiar with all of the functionality, but when it comes to dealing with some of the things that are on-prem, when it comes to dealing with some of the capabilities around cloud solution providers, or you're managing many tenants, some of that stuff is not yet, on-prem stuff may not ever make it to Graph, and I'm not making any announcements there, I'm just speculating. Because really, I mean, it's about being a cloud solution. So I don't know where we're going to end up with on-prem type capabilities. When it comes to these kind of cloud solution providers, we have plans to be able to make some of that stuff available. So the real goal is, yes, everything should be on Microsoft Graph, and therefore everything should be in the PowerShell. And that includes Skype for Business, all the Teams policy stuff. That is our goal. Asher asks about Power Automate pending actions. We have another whole work stream with regards to Power Automate, but Power Automate really falls under the Azure side of the world. And the Azure create their own SDKs using the same tool chain, and we'll see that in a moment. And so hopefully the world you're ending up in will be 2 PowerShell modules, one for all the Microsoft Graph stuff and one for all the Azure management stuff, but hopefully they will do single sign-in. I'll come back to questions because I have a feeling I'm going to get 101. And what about this? And what about this? And what about this? So we'll come back to those.
I'll collate the questions and I'll read them to you once you've got through your presentation.
Yeah. Okay. Sure. But I have plenty of time, so we're good. So what are we shipping? So we ship a Microsoft Graph meta module. that has a set of smaller modules that you can install in a single, or you can pick and choose which of these modules that you want. You can actually just pull down the Microsoft Graph.authentication module and use our invoke graph request, and I'll show you how to do that in a minute. So if you are building stuff on top of, you can just pick the modules that you actually need. If you want the simplest experience, just do install module Microsoft.graph and you will get everything. It's kind of big. It's getting smaller is the good news, and I'll talk more about why the modules are getting smaller soon. The important thing is that these modules are really built on top of other infrastructure that we have already done and we are already using. We build on top of msal.net, right? So you get all of these standard capabilities. We build on top of the .net, Microsoft.graph.core. So all of the work that we do in there rolls up. And a great example with regards to msal.net is there's a new mechanism coming out called continuous access evaluation. And it is the ability for you to get a token, and as soon as some setting is changed, that token can be invalidated in almost real time. And so if you change some kind of policy, that token is no longer good. Now, on the opposite side, the good thing is because we can immediately invalidate this token, that token can be made to last for much longer. So those tokens can last up to 28 hours. Rather than expiring every 1 hour. And this is a capability that is built into msal.net, and we are going to be able to reuse this within the PowerShell. So all of those features will roll up as they get created, and will all roll up automatically into the PowerShell. And we have a lot of other work that we have on the docket for Microsoft Graph.core, .NET libraries, and so all of that benefit will roll up into PowerShell. So I did talk through this slide in the presentation tonight, but I just want to go through it again just very quickly and to highlight the fact that one of the reasons we call it an SDK is because this is an auto-generated thing. We are reflecting the API in Graph into PowerShell in order to bring that Graph world into something that is just natively PowerShell. It's not necessarily the most rich experience, but we have infrastructure available to allow teams to add richer scenarios on top. The value this brings is it gives us complete coverage of the graph, not only Graph v1, but beta. And as the graph is updated on a weekly basis, we will update these PowerShell libraries, because we take that metadata and we take all the documentation that is in the Graph docs and we feed it into OpenAPI, an OpenAPI converter, and generate a set of modules using the AutoRest PowerShell generator. And this is the same library that the Azure teams are using to generate their PowerShell libraries. So again, trying to produce this consistent experience. And there's a set of customization directives, so we can play around with a little bit of what gets output from those that AutoRest generator. And then we layer it on top of our .NET stuff. And then we have this scenario commandlets. We allow community contributions and teams to be able to do PRs and say, here's a higher level scenario that uses the underlying commandlets to make it a little bit richer. And we'll see examples of where it might be that you might want to make things a little bit richer or a little bit simpler, because the goal is we cover like the entire surface area, and then people who focus on a particular domain can spend a little bit of time and do the extra 20% of really rich scenarios to make those things easier for people to use. And then we publish onto PowerShell Gallery, as we should. Now, let's actually get to demo and no more slides, and hopefully I won't bore you too much with my slow typing. Before we go into actually showing a command window, I just want to call out that we have got the set of getting started documentation available in the portal. You will see that it lives under the SDKs section. We are the SDKs team, but don't read too much into it. how to get started is all here. We talk about some of the conventions. If you want to kind of understand how we map the API into commands and how those the HTTP methods are mapped into verbs into PowerShell, we talk a little bit about that here. And we've got some examples on when you want to be able to do app-only unattended stuff, how to go and register an application. And we show it both using the portal and also using a script. So we're actually using the interactive mode of the PowerShell library in order to create an app registration in order to be able to do unscripted stuff. You'll also find, if you dig into some of the other documentation around the SDKs, this is a little bit of a hint of things to come. When you go and look at SDKs and we talk about how to make calls into the graph, how to project just the properties that you're interested in, we now have the PowerShell tab that shows you how to do the equivalent thing that you would do normally in the Graph API, but now we'll show you how to do it in PowerShell. And the goal, like if you go through, if you're familiar with our documentation, when you go to the reference documentation, so here's listing the users in the API, we show you the set of, this is how the HTTP request, this is how it looks in the different languages. The goal is to have the PowerShell also as an item on here. It's going to take us a little bit longer to be able to get this done, but it's very much on our plan to make PowerShell a first-class experience within the Microsoft Graph. Okay. Let's bring up a command window. So the way that you get started in Microsoft Graph, and we've tried to model it on how a lot of the other libraries work, is ConnectMG Graph. And it takes you through a device code flow sign-in process, so you can grab this, and if I go to the right tenant and do a device login, I guess I was supposed to copy the other thing, right? Let's grab this and back over here and paste this. We're probably going to just, we can now also make this just pop up the browser automatically in some environments. So I'm going to accept this. That's interesting. I have no idea why it asked me for consent there. That should be interesting. The thing is, consent's super, super important. And it's one of the stumbling blocks that folks run into when they're working with Graph, because they've worked with a lot of other APIs and they're not used to having to do this consent process. So they'll often say, hey, I have permissions to go and do this. Like if I go and do get MG user, I wonder if this is going to fail. Yeah, there you go. Insufficient privileges to complete this operation. Because although I am signed in as administrator, the PowerShell application itself, I haven't said that the PowerShell application is allowed to do things. And this is an intentional thing so that I don't accidentally click on some script that has been given to me by somebody else that goes off and does a whole bunch of things and starts accessing my corporate data using my credentials when I haven't said that I should be allowed to do it. So I'm actually going to go and grab from in our repo. I'll actually pull this window down. If you pull down our GitHub repo, there is a whole bunch of samples available, and with a bunch of different commands that you can run to try out different things, working with teams, working with sites, working with drives. I'm just going to grab this one here, which connects me to Graph, but with a set of different consents. And the reason why I was saying I'm kind of surprised that it gave me this is you only have to do this once. Consenting the application for you only have to consent once. So I'm going to do that. Now I have to sign in again because it's a different set of consent scopes. And let's do it. And now, no, I don't want to sign in with that account. Took me to the wrong browser. Is it going to remember? There we go. Phew. Excellent. And now it's asking me for a whole bunch of different things. because I asked for those scopes when I did the connect. And so this is a common challenge that people run into, is they aren't used to this process and it feels weird. But security is super, super important, and especially when you are granting something like PowerShell, which has a ton of ability to manipulate data, you want to be intentional in your choice to allow it to do these things. Now, so I'm using interactive mode because PowerShell, as we deployed it, comes with kind of its built-in own app ID. If you're running scripts, we recommend your own application in the portal and consent that application to the specific set of scopes that are needed for that particular script to run. So, cover scopes. Now, let's just get a kind of a feel as to the types of things that you can do. So if I do -command, and if I could type Microsoft.graph star, let's just select command and name and version and pipe this through more so it doesn't go scrolling. There's about 4,000 commands that are currently available. All the Intune stuff is here. Just pay attention. You'll see recently we've started adding new set for things that where normally you would you're referencing other things with an odata.bind syntax in the API. We're now using a set, and that will do a put to be able to connect things together. So if you're trying to add a member to a group or things like that, you'll often see a set. Or if you're trying to assign some entity from one place in the graph into some other entity, you'll now see set verbs. So we have a lot of aliases, we have a lot of functions. We try to map these to natural verbs within PowerShell: copy, find, export. And you see all the education stuff here. There's previews of the finance. Now, the finance stuff is actually in beta, and so that's another good conversation to bring up. You may have used this previously, and by default, it always used to access the beta APIs. By default, now, when you install the 1.0 version or 1.01, you will get the V1 version. So if you do get profile, you'll see that you're getting the V1 version. If you want to switch over to accessing the beta APIs, you can do this, and it will switch you over, and now you will be, the commands that are available to you are the beta APIs and will be targeting the beta endpoint. So that's a new little gotcha to watch out for when working with the released version. Now, if I were to do basically the simplest thing possible, hopefully now that I did the consent, this is actually going to work, and return the set of users. One of the things that you will find kind of handy is we've added in a --debug option. I said we added in a maybe it's -debug. That's the problem with switching back and forwards between PowerShell and CLI. 2 dashes, one of them will work. So if you now look at this, you can see that we show you what actually gets called. What is the URI that actually gets called? So if your parameters aren't quite right, your command's not working, --debug, and this is especially important when you're creating stuff, and we'll show you the payload that actually gets created. Okay, so I'm saying I'm going to need to speed this up so that I have plenty of time for questions at the end. Okay, so that is a really useful thing to find out if something is not working for you. If you run into a particular endpoint that you really can't get working with the libraries, first of all, file an issue with us and let us know it's not working. And then secondly, invoke MG graph request. So this, if I just do I get help on this, invoke MG graph request. And as I mentioned earlier, this comes in the Graph Authentication Library. So if you just want to pull down our authentication library, that's really small, and you will get this ability to do this, and it will go and do all the token magic for you. And so now you can call get invoke mg graph request, and you can do method get URI, and you can just put it in whatever URI you need to be able to call on graph.microsoft. Type this whole thing out without making a mistake. There you go. And there it comes back with the data. And there's an output file path, so you can push it out into a file. You can provide a token if you want. In fact, one of the things you may not have noticed is if we do get help on connect mg graph, there's now the ability to provide an access token in here. I must admit I went backwards and forwards as to whether or not this was a good idea a number of times, but there it is. You can now come with your own token in order to be able to call any of the graph capabilities. I want to talk about another change that folks may have seen if they've been previously using older versions of the library. If I run get help on mgmail, you will see that all of the parameters that are not primitive parameters are objects. And you may have in the past seen a lot more primitive parameters. We did a process called flattening, where, or should I say, autorest did a mechanism called flattening, where if it saw a simple object, it would flatten it into a set of simple primitive properties. And this was convenient in some cases. It was also confusing a little bit in other cases. Unfortunately, doesn't work now that we've added the additional properties. So the way all of the Graph SDKs work is if you make a call to an API and there are properties in that response that aren't in the shape of the model, they get put into the additional properties collection. So when it comes to annotations or some new property that has been added recently, or if it's an open type where teams are allowed, like in Planner, they're allowed to add new properties without actually describing it in the metadata, you'll find those properties in additional properties. So in adding that additional properties that is just kind of a catch-all, it wouldn't allow us to do the flattening anymore. So you will find you will need to construct more objects than you previously did in some of the commands. The only good thing about this is when it comes to generating the code snippets, it will be a little bit easier for us to generate the code snippets because we won't have to guess, well, okay, is this a flattened object or is this non-flattened object? Because what would happen is if we had objects that had circular references in them, obviously we couldn't flatten those. So thing to keep an eye out. Now you're looking at this thing going, okay, what on earth is an Microsoft Graph message 1 and what properties does it have? Aha, you have to know to do -full. And when you do -full, you are going to get a inordinate amount of descriptions of what these properties look like, and you can just create these as dictionaries on the command line in order to specify these properties. Now, we will probably be moving these docs up to this location. This link doesn't work at the moment. We will be moving these docs up into these locations because turns out the reason why our modules are so large, and if you download them all, they're close to a gig. It's because these docs are so large. One of the modules had 122 megabytes of docs in it. So we're going to push the detailed docs up onto these websites, and that will significantly reduce the size of the modules that you actually need to download. And I think that covers all the things that I want to mention about PowerShell. So then I'm going to flip over very quickly to command prompt here. So we can do the same process that we do in PowerShell for a CLI. And so now we have this tool, which at the moment is only shipped as an MSI executable, but Jackett, who's on the call, who's the dev working on this, is working furiously to make it available across platform. It will work across platform. We just don't have the installers available across platform. And this now gives you a command line tool so that you can now say mg users. Sorry, I got to remember this. User list message. Let's see if I get it right. Sorry, not list message. I want to do list user. And this is going to fail because it's going to tell me I didn't log in. Come on, you got to do this right, Darrell. So let me log in first. MG, log in. Now, just as a caveat here, right? This is still very early stage. You can, our repo is out in public. You can go take a look. You can go download the MSI and play around with it, but it's going to change. So, and you notice that when I did log in there, it popped up the browser. I didn't have to go and click on the link, and it's going to go do this. Fabulous. And now I'm going to hold my breath a little bit, and we're going to do users, user, list user. And you're going to come back with a list of users, but instead of being a PowerShell response, it's going to be a big chunk of JSON. And so this is just the different world that we live in when we're in this space, and it's a case of, well, some people prefer to be in the command line, and some people prefer to be in PowerShell. It's the idea should be that the capabilities are the same. Now, how do I now, this is a big blob of data. How do I get things that are of more interest here? Well, we do the same thing that you do in Azure. There is what's called a James path query that you can use to filter the results that come back. So I'm saying, go get me the first 10 entries and just return me back the ID and name of this thing. And there's an output parameter so you can put it into a file. And just to give you an example of, you can do all the interesting stuff. I can go and say, find me the mail folders. It didn't actually look. It's asking, oh, it wants a user ID. My apologies. It's kind of cool too, is like this one is like if you slightly type the parameter wrong, it'll hint and say, oh, I think you meant this parameter name, which is kind of handy. Oh, it doesn't like me for that particular scenario. Okay, well, I'm not going to worry. Maybe I just did, I didn't consent to the appropriate thing. So I'm not going to dig into too much, but you can see we have started to build this thing. We are building it off the same set of open API files. So the experience should be very similar. It's going to get bigger than this. We have a little bit of a challenge in that Graph is really, really large. And if I do users, user, is this how I get the list of commands? I think it is. Yeah, so there's the list of commands. If I do like users, which is only small, but if I did users mail, yeah, so this starts to become a really long list of commands under this one kind of group. So we got to figure out how to group these things in a way that makes the most sense in order to be able to scale to the size that Graph is. So it's coming. We're working on it, but it is still very fluid. And I want to make one more comment about CLI before we go to questions. And I've shown this diagram before, but this is what is really interesting and why we really chose this path to building the CLI. And we use a Python core under the covers, is it has the possibility of generating these other mechanisms like Ansible modules and Magic modules and potentially Terraform type capabilities. So that would bring that whole world of DevOps to the Graph if we're able to leverage this infrastructure that is there. And with that, we can hit questions.
Yeah, so that's awesome, Darrell. Thanks for driving all that and showing all the CLI stuff as well. It's great to see all the work that Jackett and the team have been doing in the background on that one. So you've already answered the question around what PowerShell SDK modules are included that are like existing PowerShell models for various parts of M365 at the moment. But Alexander asked, from a Microsoft Teams, will they build their own module on top of the Microsoft Graph PowerShell SDK? Is this expected now?
We would encourage them to do one of two things. Either add new, richer scenario commands into the existing modules that we ship and deliver, so you will just automatically get them out of the box. And we're working with the PowerShell team now to get this the PowerShell library into Cloud Shell. So it will be there out of the box. Or they could continue to control their own module with the release cadence, but we really will be working with them to encourage them to build on top of our library in order to bring that consistency of experience, get the single sign-on experience. And this is really important for a big chunk of our customers, especially in the area like education, where administrators tend not to necessarily be quite as experienced. And we need these really simple, straightforward scenarios where there's a single sign-on across all of the different M365 capabilities. I've had conversations with a number of different teams. The Teams team is one that I still need to connect with in order to make this happen. But if you want to do me a favor and you want to apply pressure on them and tell the Teams team that they should really be building on top of this library, that customer feedback is always one of the most powerful things.
Yeah, and Alan also mentions the unified communication part of MS Teams as well has PowerShell modules that would suit being in here too. So you've got some homework, Darrell.
Oh, yes, this is a journey. We had to ship something first, and we've had a ton of great feedback from the community in getting there. And I think the more and more I talk to teams, the more they see the vision, and the more customers can provide that feedback that yes, we want one coherent module, the easier it will be to bring everybody on board.
Yeah, I agree. And so Adrian mentioned, are there any plans to improve the experience with multi-factor authentication for unattended authentication? It's a tongue twister of sorts.
Well, so my way to punt that is you should talk to the MSAL team and make sure that they make that possible, and then we will leverage all of those benefits. That's very much a capability that AAD or identity need to make happen, and we will absorb all of that goodness.
Yeah, and Benjamin mentioned, like, how do you auth with an unattended script? So does this plug into Azure automation framework? That's a good question.
You can do client credentials. We do not yet do MSI, or whatever it's currently called, the magic over in the Azure world, where you use a resource as the identity. But one of our major projects in the SDK world is to align between Graph authorization and Azure identity, or Azure SDK authentication. And over in the Azure identity world, they have what they call a MSI token credential. And yeah, so we'll be bringing in managed identity because we're bringing it into our .NET SDK. So, and then it will roll up. And I just need to call out to Jay. I apologize for making the insinuation that educational IT admins are less skilled. As it came out of my mouth, I realized that was not the right thing to say.
Foot in mouth moment. When you demoed the scopes and you were plugging in the scopes, Alexander was asking, how can I get all those scopes from PowerShell? Is there a way you can do that in PowerShell and like show me the scopes for Exchange or something?
There should be, because we actually do that in Graph Explorer. In order to show that modified permissions list, we go and call the Service Principal API. And I think you have to call the Service Principal API for Microsoft Graph, and then you can get the OAuth 2 grants. That would be a great sample that we should add into the thing. And one of the little thing I wanted to bring up is we currently have the samples buried in the repo for the SDK itself. I'm thinking we should pull that out into its own repo to help encourage community contributions, and so that we just have an independent repo that just includes snippets. So if anybody's interested in contributing to that, please ping me, and we'll get a separate snippet repo going.
And then JD asked, does this mean that we'll be seeing PowerShell code snippets in the docs and the Graph Explorer soon?
As soon as we can have it in one, we can have it in both.
Yeah.
We just have to write the code.
That's engineering time. Right?
How do you ping me? The easiest way to get hold of me is Darrell_Miller on Twitter.
And then Shrivanath James Pass query, does this filter on the server side or the client side? Assuming the client side.
Great question. Yes, client side, but all of the OData parameters will be surfaced up into the actual CLI, just as it's done in PowerShell. So you will be able to provide $filter, $select to do the server-side filtering as well. So whichever you prefer.
And then also, are there any plans to release APIs to interact with MS Power Automate pending actions? I'm not
sure what pending actions are. Reach out to me and give me a link to what this pending action is. It a case of embedding PowerShell in a Power Automate? If so, we should definitely make sure that experience works.
This is
actions.
The actions one has to take on the flow approvals. Okay. Yeah, we might need to take that one offline. Have a bit of a thing into it. Okay, thank you so much, Darrell. There is one last thing I wanted to mention with 4 minutes remaining, so I'm going to steal your screen.
Yeah, go ahead.
There you go. So we've been working on this for a long time with the MS Docs group. We are piloting right now. It's a soft launch. We're not announcing this on a blog or anything. A new MS Graph on Microsoft Q&A. You may already be using Microsoft Q&A for your Azure questions and development. So you'll notice here that all of these areas actually represent areas of the Microsoft Graph, as well as things like the common aspects of the Microsoft Graph that we are putting together. The good news is we actually have a dedicated team of engineers that are monitoring the questions that come through on here, and we have SLAs to actually respond with answers within 48 hours. And so this is it's a big change for us from where right now we still support, and we will continue to support Stack Overflow. But the idea being is that if we answer the questions in our own forums, there are a lot of other benefits we get from being able to show these answers on related Microsoft Graph Docs pages, as well as other parts of the dev experience in, the learn experience and the code samples experience. The experience, you can sign up as an MVP or as an individual, and you can control your profile card. And so you'll be able to see when it's actually an official Microsoft person responding versus the community or an MVP. So we're piloting this as a soft launch. If questions, please feel free to jump through to this page and ask your questions. And as I say, we've got a tier 1 team looking after this. And if the tier 1 team can't answer it, then it gets escalated to the underlying workload PMs and engineering groups as well. So this is a new effort that we're starting to try and improve how we can help with questions. And we'd love your feedback. Again, you can reach out to us on Twitter. Is probably definitely the easiest way, with myself and Darrell and Brian for now. And as I say, if you're interested in contributing here, it does have a very similar platform set up to how MSDM forums and TechNet forums used to work. But again, this is going to be in the future our official place that will send you. We will still monitor Stack Overflow, but we're going to have SLAs set in this Q&A forum. So love your feedback here. This has been a lot of work by a lot of people. So big thank you to Anoop and Kendall and the rest of the team there for driving that work and getting this out there in the wild. So with that, we are at time. So same time next month. It's always the first Tuesday of the month. So that's going to be the 3rd of November. And I expect none of the Americans to be here because that is actually election day. So I look forward to seeing a lot of Europeans in that community call next month. Brian, thank you for taking the first part of that session. Thanks, Darrell and Ben, for presenting today. That was awesome. Thanks very much.